The morning my son brought Renee home for the first time, I noticed how her eyes moved. They didn't rest on Tyler's face the way you'd expect from a woman in love. They drifted across the living room, up the staircase, along the back wall where I'd hung the old photos of Caldwell Supply Company's first warehouse. She looked at everything in that house the way an appraiser looks at a property before an auction. I didn't say a word. Tyler was 34. He had his mother's jaw and my stubbornness, and he'd worked at the company for 6 years, learning invoices and vendor contracts and the particular art of keeping a client calm when a delivery runs 3 days late. He was good at the work. Not great yet, but good. Carol used to say he just needed more time to grow into himself. She said that about a lot of things before she got sick. She had a way of being patient with the world that I never quite managed to learn. Carol passed 4 years before Tyler brought Renee home. Pancreatic cancer. 7 months from diagnosis to the end. I won't dwell on that because this story is not about grief, though grief is threaded through all of it the way groundwater runs beneath a field invisible until you dig. What I will say is this. After Carol died, I did something that confused people who knew me. I quietly transferred the ownership of Caldwell Supply Company, all 3 warehouse locations, the fleet of 14 delivery vehicles, the commercial contracts, everything into a trust. I'd had a lawyer draft the year before Carol passed. The trust was airtight. I was the sole trustee. Tyler was named as eventual beneficiary, yes, but with specific conditions attached, conditions that gave me complete control over the timing and terms of any transfer. My lawyer, a man named Gerald Marsh, who'd been handling my affairs for 20 years, told me it was one of the most thorough ownership structures he'd ever put together for a private business this size. I did not tell Tyler about the trust. I did not explain the structure to anyone outside of Gerald's office. When people asked, I just said the business was mine and I intended to keep running it for as long as my knees held up. That was true. It just wasn't the whole truth. So when Tyler called me on a Tuesday evening in October to tell me he was going to propose to Renee, the first thing I felt was happiness for him. Real happiness. He sounded like a younger version of himself, nervous in the good way, the way a person sounds when they're about to do something that frightens them because it matters too much. I told him I was proud of him. I told him his mother would have been proud too. He went quiet for a moment on the other end of the line, and I let the silence sit there without trying to fill it. The second thing I felt, if I'm being honest with myself, was a small tightening in my chest. Not dread exactly. More like the feeling you get when you're driving on a highway and the weather shifts, and you look at the sky and think, that storm is moving faster than it looks. I kept that to myself. The engagement party was held at a restaurant downtown, one of those places where the menu doesn't have prices and the portions are the size of a business card. Renee's parents flew in from Phoenix. Her father was a retired pharmaceutical sales manager who wore a watch that cost more than my first delivery truck. Her mother smiled at everything with the particular warmth of someone who has practiced smiling in mirrors. They were pleasant enough people. They just looked at my warehouse buildings the same way Renee looked at the photos on my wall, like they were calculating. At the party, Renee's father shook my hand and told me Tyler had told him a great deal about the family business. I said that was nice to hear. He said it sounded like quite an operation. I said we'd worked hard over the years. He said, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, that family businesses like that were real legacy builders, real wealth builders. I agreed that they could be, and then I excused myself to get another drink. The wedding was the following June, out on a property in the hill country, white tents and string lights and a band that played until 11. Tyler looked happier than I'd seen him since before his mother's diagnosis. When he danced with Renee, he held her the way a man holds something he's afraid to lose. I watched them from my table and I decided, sincerely, to give this marriage every benefit of the doubt I had. I watched Renee's eyes drift toward the wedding gift envelopes on the collection table, and I kept that decision firmly in place. For the first 4 months, things were quiet. Tyler and Renee moved into a house in the suburbs, a nice place with a 2-car garage and a yard that backed up to a creek. Tyler kept coming to work every morning. Renee had a job at a marketing firm downtown, something with event planning and corporate clients. Life looked normal. Then came the Sunday dinner. I cooked the way I always did when Tyler came over, pot roast, Carol's recipe, The one with the red wine and the rosemary that she'd written out on an index card I keep taped inside the cabinet door. Renee ate with enthusiasm and complimented the food twice, which I appreciated. After dinner, when we were sitting in the living room with coffee, Tyler set his mug down and said, "Dad, Renee and I have been talking." I looked at my son. In my experience, those 6 words are the most reliably dangerous sentence in the English language when they come from an adult child with a spouse sitting next to them. I kept my face completely still. Tyler said they'd been thinking about the future, about the company, about what the next chapter might look like. Renee had some ideas, he said, and he thought it would be worth hearing them out. I said I was always happy to hear ideas. Renee leaned forward. She had a way of presenting herself when she was about to make a pitch, chin slightly up, voice measured, the kind of deliberate composure that comes from rehearsal. She said she'd been doing some research into the plumbing supply wholesale market. She said consolidation was happening across the industry. She said there were regional buyers and even some national distributors who were actively acquiring independent operations like Caldwell. She said the timing, from everything she could see, was exceptional. She said she thought we should at least have some conversations about what a sale might look like. I let her finish. I asked her what made her think we were interested in selling. She smiled and said she understood I'd built the company and that it meant a great deal to me personally. She said she respected that completely. She said this was just about thinking practically, thinking about maximizing the return on everything I'd put into it, thinking about what the money could do for the family in the long run. I said I'd think about it. She said that was all she was asking. On the drive home that night, I turned the radio off and drove in silence for 20 minutes, which was 10 minutes longer than the actual drive, because I took the long way through the old part of town, past the block where Carol and I had rented our first apartment, past the original location of Caldwell Supply before we moved to the warehouse district. I sat in the parking lot of a gas station for a while and thought about what I was going to do. When I got home, I called Gerald Marsh. He picked up even though it was 9:30 on a Sunday, because he's the kind of lawyer who picks up on Sunday evenings, which is exactly why I've kept him for 20 years. I told him what had happened. I told him what I was thinking. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he said he thought my instincts were sound, and that if I wanted to move forward with the approach I was describing, he'd have the paperwork ready by Wednesday. Over the next 2 weeks, Renee called me 3 times. Each call was friendly, casual, just checking in, did I have any more thoughts? I told her each time that I was still thinking. I told her these things took time. I used the word deliberate a lot. I also, during this period, let Tyler know in what I framed as a practical business conversation that the company's financial records were stored in a set of binders in my office at the main warehouse, and that he was welcome to bring Renee by sometime if she wanted to look things over, since she seemed to have a serious interest in the business side of things. Tyler said that was really generous of me. I said family should have access to information. What Tyler did not know, and what Renee certainly did not know, was that Gerald and I had spent the better part of those 2 weeks preparing a second set of financial binders. These binders were meticulous. They had tabs and dividers and professional formatting. They also contained numbers that were systematically, carefully, and specifically wrong. Not wildly wrong, nothing that would look fabricated. Wrong in the way that a compass can be slightly off and still seem perfectly functional until you've walked 3 miles in the wrong direction. Revenue figures that were real but attributed to the wrong fiscal years. Depreciation schedules with altered asset values. One contract, a major commercial account with a regional hotel chain, listed as having lapsed, when in reality it had just been renewed for another 5 years. The real binders were in a locked cabinet at Gerald's office. I set the altered ones on my desk in a neat stack and told my office manager to let Tyler and his wife in if they came by when I wasn't there. They came by on a Thursday, 2 weeks later, when I'd arranged to be at the Henderson County warehouse all morning for a fleet inspection. My office manager, a woman named Diane who'd been with the company for 16 years and who I trusted completely and who I had told nothing about the binders, let them in and made them coffee and gave them full access to my office. They spent 2 hours there. Diane told me afterward that Renee had taken photos of nearly every page with her phone. I thanked Diane and told her she'd done exactly right. 3 days later, Tyler called and asked if Renee and he could come to dinner again. I said of course. I made Carol's pot roast again, because it felt right to have something familiar in the room. This time, Renee came prepared. She'd had the binder numbers compiled into a summary document that she printed and brought in a folder. She laid it on the coffee table after dinner with the careful precision of someone making a formal presentation. She said she'd gone through the records carefully. She said the picture they painted was concerning. She said revenue had been declining for the past 3 years, that 2 of the major contracts appeared to have ended, that the fleet depreciation was significant, and that in her honest assessment, the window for getting a good sale price was actually narrowing rather than widening. She said if we wanted to maximize value, we probably needed to move sooner rather than later. She slid the folder toward me. I looked at the numbers in the folder. I recognized them. They were mine, or the ones I'd made, and I'd made them well. I told Renee I appreciated how much work she'd put into this. I told her I wanted to share something with her. I got up and went to my study and came back with a different folder. This one had Gerald Marsh's letterhead on the front page and contained the actual financial statements, audited by an independent firm the previous year, along with the current contract register and the renewal documents for the hotel chain account. I set it on the coffee table next to hers. I told her that the records she'd looked at in my office were not the current operating records. I told her they were an older set that I'd kept for reference and that I should have been more clear about which binders were which. I apologized for any confusion. Renee looked at the folder in front of her. She looked at the one I'd brought. She opened mine and looked at the first page. The color left her face the way water drains from a sink. The hotel chain contract alone was worth more in annual revenue than the entire picture her summary had painted. The company's actual margins were nearly double what the altered binders had suggested. The fleet was 2 years newer in aggregate than the depreciation schedules had shown. The total enterprise value, based on the previous year's EBITDA, and the kind of multiples currently being paid in the sector, was somewhere in the range that made the watch on Renee's father's wrist look modest. Tyler was leaning forward, looking at the numbers, and I watched the expression on his face change slowly, the way the sky changes before a storm, going from confusion to calculation to something harder and quieter. He asked me which set of numbers was real. I told him the ones Gerald had prepared were the real ones. I told him they'd been independently audited and that Gerald could answer any questions he had about the methodology. Tyler looked at his wife. Renee said the binders in the office must have been misfiled, and I just explained that. So there was obviously no issue. She was just working with the information she'd been given. Tyler kept looking at her. I said I wanted to address something else before we moved on. I said that I understood there was real interest in exploring what the company might be worth, and that I wanted to be direct about where I stood. I said Caldwell Supply was not for sale, not to a regional buyer, not to a national distributor, not to anyone. I said I had built it over 35 years. I said Carol and I had built it, because that was the truth, because she had handled every piece of paperwork for the first 12 years while I was out running deliveries, and her fingerprints were on the foundation of everything. I said the company was going to stay in this family as a going concern, not as a check divided into accounts. I said if Tyler wanted to eventually take over the operation, I would be glad to work toward that and we could talk about a real transition plan that made sense. But that was a conversation between me and my son, not a sales strategy. Renee started to say something about long-term financial planning and the value of liquidity, and Tyler said her name. Just her name. Quietly. The way you'd close a door. She stopped. The drive to that moment had been a long one, and I want to be honest about what it cost, because I think that honesty is important. I am not a man who enjoys conflict. I spent the better part of 8 months navigating the discomfort of knowing what was happening around me without reacting to it, and there were evenings more than I'd like to count when I sat on the back porch, with a glass of bourbon, and the weight of it sat heavy on my chest. There were nights when I thought about Carol and wished she were there, not because she would have known what to do, but because she had a way of making difficult things feel less like they were happening to you and more like they were just part of the world, which is a distinction that is harder to maintain when you're alone. But I had stayed quiet. I had stayed patient. I had let the situation develop at its own pace until the moment was right, because that was the only way to know for certain what I was dealing with. After Renee excused herself to use the restroom, Tyler and I sat in the living room and didn't speak for a moment. He was staring at the folder. I looked at the photo of his mother on the shelf across the room, the one from the year we opened the second warehouse location, where she's standing out front in a hard hat she borrowed from one of the contractors, grinning like she'd just won something. Tyler said, "Dad, how long have you known?" I said, "Since about the second Sunday dinner." He said, "And you didn't say anything." I said I wanted to see how it played out. I said I wanted to give him the chance to see it too, without me putting words to it first. He put his face in his hands for a moment, not crying. Tyler isn't a crier. Never has been just the gesture a person makes when they need a second to let something land. He looked up and asked me if the business was actually okay. I told him the business was better than okay. I told him last year was the strongest year since 2019. I told him the Henderson County location alone had grown its commercial account base by 22%. He nodded slowly. He said he owed me an apology. I told him the only thing I wanted from him was clarity about the road ahead. Not an apology, just clarity. He nodded again and didn't say anything else, and I didn't push, because some things need to settle in their own time. Renee came back from the restroom with her composure reinstalled, the way a person reapplies a mask in a mirror. She thanked me for dinner. She said the pot roast was wonderful. She said she hoped there were no hard feelings about the business conversation, that she'd just been trying to be helpful. I told her I appreciated that. I walked them to the door and watched the headlights of Tyler's car back out of the driveway and disappear down the street. I went inside and washed the dishes and listened to the radio, an old country station that Carol used to tune in on Sunday evenings while she read in the living room. I stood at the sink for a long time after the dishes were done, just listening. In the weeks that followed, things were quiet in the way that air goes quiet before a pressure change. Tyler came to the warehouse once during that period, on a Wednesday morning, unannounced. He walked through the whole facility, the main floor, the loading dock, the back inventory rooms, the small conference area where we held our weekly scheduling meetings. He spent about 2 hours. He talked to Diane, to the warehouse supervisor, to 2 of the drivers who were unloading a truck. He found me in my office at the end of it and sat down across from my desk the way he used to when he was in his 20s and had a problem he was working through. He said he wanted to understand the trust structure. I told him Gerald could walk him through it in detail, but the short version was this. The company was held in trust with me as sole trustee, Tyler named as beneficiary. Transfer contingent on terms I'd set out with Gerald's guidance. The terms were not punitive or complicated. They were just thoughtful, the kind of terms a person puts in place when they want to make sure a business they've spent a life building lands in hands that will take care of it. Tyler asked what the conditions were. I told him the main condition was that any future transfer would have to be approved by me and couldn't occur under circumstances where the business was immediately intended for resale to a third party. I told him there were some other provisions around operational continuity. I told him Gerald's door was open, Tyler said. So she never could have pushed you into selling. I said no. I said even if I'd wanted to sell and I didn't, the trust structure would have required a process that would have taken months and would have been entirely under my control. He sat with that for a while. Then he said something that I've turned over in my mind many times since. He said, "I think I knew something was wrong before the second dinner. I just didn't let myself look at it directly." I told him that was a human thing to do. I told him it was especially human when the person involved was someone you loved. He said he'd been doing a lot of thinking. I said I figured. He said he was going to be okay, and that he'd handle things on his side, and that he'd appreciate some time before we talked about it further. I said he could have all the time he needed. He left, and I watched his truck pull out of the lot and merge onto the highway, and I sat there in the quiet of my office for a while and looked at the framed photo above my desk, the one from the opening day of the original location 35 years ago. Me and Carol standing in front of the sign, 2 people who had no idea what they were getting into and were going to do it anyway. I've heard people say that patience is passive, that waiting for things to unfold on their own is the same as doing nothing. I've never believed that. Real patience is not the absence of action. It's a different kind of action, harder in some ways than acting outright, because it requires you to hold yourself still while everything around you moves, and to trust that the moment for clarity will come if you give it room to arrive. Carol used to say that still water runs deep. I used to tease her that that was a greeting card sentiment. She'd say, "Laugh all you want, Robert. The people who talk the most are usually the ones who understand the least." And she'd go back to reading, perfectly untroubled. She was right more often than I ever gave her adequate credit for, and I've spent the years since she left trying to correct that particular debt. There's a version of this story where I confront Renee the second I understand what she is. There's a version where I pull Tyler aside after that first dinner and lay it all out for him. There's a version where I call Gerald the day Tyler tells me about the engagement and restructure everything before the wedding even happens. Maybe those versions work out fine too. But I chose the version where I waited and watched and prepared quietly in the background. And I chose it for a specific reason, because I wanted Tyler to see it himself. I wanted him to be the one to look at the woman sitting next to him and recognize what he was looking at, without his father putting words to it first. I wanted him to own that knowledge, because knowledge your father gives you is a different thing than knowledge you come to yourself, and the decisions that come from the second kind tend to hold better. Tyler moved out of the house on a rainy Saturday in March. He didn't call me beforehand. He called me after, when he was sitting in the parking lot of a storage facility with a trailer attached to his truck, and he asked if he could come by. I said I'd put the coffee on. He sat in the kitchen for a while and didn't say much, and I didn't ask him to say anything. I made eggs because it was almost noon and neither of us had eaten, and a problem always looks slightly more manageable on a full stomach, which is something my own father used to say, and which I've found to be reliably true. Eventually, he told me the shape of it, not all of it, because some of it wasn't mine to know, but enough. He said that after the dinner at my house, things had come apart fairly quickly once he started asking questions he'd been avoiding. He said some of the answers had been a long time in the making and had nothing to do with the business. He said he was okay. He said the word twice. I told him I was sorry it had gotten to this point. I meant it without qualification. He said he knew I did. We sat at that kitchen table for the better part of the afternoon. At some point, I pulled out the index card from the inside of the cabinet door, the one with Carol's pot roast recipe in her handwriting, and I showed it to him. I don't know exactly why I did it in that moment. He held it carefully by the edges, the way you'd hold something that might not survive being held too firmly, and he looked at it for a long time. He said, "She wrote everything down." I said she did. I said that was who she was. She believed that the important things should be written down so they couldn't get lost. He handed the card back and I put it in its place. Things after that moved the way things move when a long tension releases, not dramatically, just steadily, like a window being opened in a room that's been closed too long. Tyler threw himself into the work with an energy he hadn't had before, the kind of energy that comes from a person deciding who they are and choosing to act like it. He started showing up early. He started asking the right questions about the commercial accounts. He sat in on a negotiation with a contractor in November and handled himself well enough that the contractor asked me afterward who the young man was, and I told him that was the next generation of Caldwell Supply, and to expect to be dealing with him increasingly over the coming years. The contractor said, "Good genes." I said, "His mother's." There's a thing that happens when you've held something tightly for a long time and then you can finally set it down. Not rest exactly, it's not as comfortable as rest. More like the feeling of your hands after you've been carrying a weight. That strange combination of relief and awareness of your own strength. I felt something like that. Driving home one evening in late November, the sky that cold blue it gets just after sunset in the hill country, the radio on low, the highway mostly empty. I thought about Carol. I thought about the day we'd decided to take the loan for the first warehouse, both of us sitting at the same kitchen table, a stack of papers in front of us, knowing it was a risk, and knowing we were going to take it. She'd been calm in a way that I was borrowing from in real time. She'd put her hand on the papers and said, "Whatever it is, we handle it together." And we had, for 31 years. I thought about what she would have made of all this, the binders, the trust structure, the long game I'd played. Knowing Carol, she probably would have done it differently. She would have found some way to speak plainly to Renee early on, some way that was kind and clear in equal measure, some way that might or might not have changed anything, but at least would have left no one any room to misunderstand. Carol always preferred direct water to still water, whatever she said otherwise. But Carol wasn't here, and I'd done it my way, which is the only way any of us can do anything, in the end. We work with the tools we have. I turned off the highway and drove the last mile home on back roads, past the Methodist church where Carol's service had been, past the old pecan grove that's been there longer than anyone around here can account for, past the gravel road that leads to the original property where we'd rented that first apartment. I pulled into the driveway and sat for a moment in the quiet. The house was lit from inside. The warm yellow-orange of the kitchen lights, the blue flicker of the television in the den. Tyler's truck was in the driveway. He'd been staying in the guest room for the past few weeks while he got his next steps sorted out, which felt right in a way I hadn't expected. The house had been too quiet for too long. I could hear the television through the front door when I walked in, some sports program he'd probably fallen asleep to. I hung up my jacket and went to the kitchen and put the kettle on and stood there for a moment in the familiar warmth of it. The index card was still there on the inside of the cabinet door. Carol's handwriting, blue ink, slightly faded, pot roast recipe, wine, and rosemary. I put my finger against the edge of the card without lifting it from the door, just touching it lightly, the way you'd touch something to confirm it was still there. Then I went about making the tea. There are things I know now that I wish I'd understood sooner in my life. I know that the people who will try to take from you will almost always announce themselves if you know how to listen. Not with words. The words are usually reassuring, careful, well considered. They announce themselves with their eyes, with the direction of their attention, with the questions they ask in the first week versus the month after. I know that the best protection isn't confrontation, and it isn't distance. It's preparation, quiet and thorough, finished long before you think you'll need it. I know that the hardest part of being a parent isn't making the decisions for your child. It's creating the conditions in which your child can make the decision themselves, and then getting out of the way and trusting them to do it. That is harder than anything I've done in business. It's harder than any negotiation, any loan, any difficult year. It requires a level of patience and restraint that I'm not sure I fully understood until I was forced to practice it. And I know this is the thing I come back to most, that the best things I have ever done in my life I did quietly. The morning I decided to start the company. The afternoon I asked Carol to marry me, just the two of us on a walk. No occasion, no plan. The evening I sat in Gerald's office and built a structure that protected everything she and I had worked for together. No announcement, no audience, just the decision, and the work, and the long patience of waiting to see if it held. It held. Tyler came into the kitchen while the kettle was heating, hair disheveled from the couch, and asked if there was enough water for 2 cups. I said there was always enough. He sat down at the kitchen table, and I made the tea and set a cup in front of him, and sat across from him in the chair I've sat in for 30 years, in the house we've had for 28, in the life that Carol and I built out of nothing but time and stubbornness, and the willingness to keep showing up. Tyler wrapped his hands around the mug. He said, "Dad, tell me about when you and Mom started the company, the real beginning. I want to understand it from the start." I looked at my son. Outside, the pecan tree in the backyard was moving slightly in the November wind, the branches catching the light from the kitchen window. The house was warm. The tea was hot. I said, "All right," and I started from the beginning.